Good afternoon, and thank you to everyone for being here. And thank you also for your patience with the timing. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to introduce you to Francesca Ammon, who will speak tonight as part of the Department of Landscape Architecture's Stanley White Lecture Series. And the time confusion, I'll just say, is really a testament to her interdisciplinarity. We have 4 separate programs that are sponsoring this talk between landscape architecture, the School of Architecture, the Environmental Humanities Reading Group that is sponsored by the Humanities Research Institute, and then of course the Krannert Art Museum, for which this lecture's theme of historic preservation and urban renewal and memory of place is really related to the CAM exhibition that I was co-curator with John Seidel and David Hayes and Jeff Poss, Making Place for the Arts at Home, Performance in Midcentury Modern Architecture, which if you haven't had a chance to see yet, I hope you will take an opportunity to go over to CAM and take a look and add your thoughts on the wall in particular that asks for our participation about the arts in place here in Champaign-Urbana. And because we're going to be talking this afternoon about land ownership and control, it seems particularly important to restate the university's land acknowledgement. And as a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign has a responsibility to acknowledge the historical context in which it exists. We are currently on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Ottawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. It is necessary for us to acknowledge these Native nations and for us to work with them as we move forward as an institution with Native peoples at the core of our efforts. This evening, in introducing Professor Ammon, I want to just point out a few things. She is Associate Professor of City and Regional Planning and Historic Preservation at the University of Pennsylvania's Stuart Weitzman School of Design. She's a social and cultural historian of the post-World War II built environment, and she's author of the excellent book, Bulldozer. If you have not read this book or put it on your shelf, highly recommended. It's Bulldozer, Demolition and Clearance of the Post-War Landscape, which is winner of the Lewis Mumford Prize for the best book in American planning history. She's currently writing History of Post-War Preservation and Urban Renewal based on the Philadelphia neighborhood of Society Hill, which she'll talk about this evening. And she's also published 2 digital humanities projects. Preserving Society Hill integrates photographs, oral histories, and architectural data into narratives of urban change. And Sunset Over Sunset uses Ed Russello's Los Angeles photographs to illuminate vernacular redevelopment. She currently serves as president of the Society for American City and Regional Planning History, which has my favorite acronym in the world, SACRIF. Everyone should join. And she is a member of the boards of the Preservation Alliance for Greater Philadelphia and the Public Art Commission. So thank you, Professor Ammon, for joining us this evening.
Great. Well, good evening. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Kate, for the invitation. Thanks also to Pollyanna Ree, who invited me. I know is at another conference today, but I really appreciate the invitation. And the talk today is about the city of Philadelphia and the neighborhood of Society Hill, and grows out of both a digital humanities project I'm working on and a book project. And I'll integrate the digital humanities project into my comments today. I'll be looking at the urban renewal era, the post-World War II period when cities were radically remade around the country. And they did things a little bit differently than the typical way in Philadelphia, integrating rehabilitation and historic preservation. And other places did that too, but Philadelphia did it earlier and more dramatically than a lot of other places did, and we're pretty significant in that. And I'm gonna think about what that meant. What did it mean to use preservation as part of urban renewal, and also at this moment when preservation as a field was formalizing as well, what did people understand preservation itself to mean too? So those are some of the ideas, and connected especially to housing and how this was applied in residential environments. All right. Let's see. Okay, I want to begin by recognizing the many archives from which this work has been derived, largely located in Philadelphia, some of them digital, many of them physical. Could not do this without all the many materials. And in fact, probably couldn't do this if I didn't live in Philadelphia, because it has been an aggregation of many different materials, very site-based, to figure out what happened on a project that had really different outcomes for each individual lot. I also want to acknowledge a team of women who lived in Society Hill during urban renewal, and at one moment realized that the people who have been a part of this story were dying, were getting old and dying, and they should capture their stories. And so in the early 2000s, started an oral history project where they interviewed nearly 100 people. They called their project Philadelphia 19106, that's the zip code of Society Hill. Many of these women are now deceased too, but we joined forces to think about how can we get some of these stories out there, and we decided that a website would be a good way for doing that. There's also the physical transcripts and audio recordings are available at Temple University Archives too, but without their work and collaboration, this would not be possible. I continued the work that they started, but they did the bulk of this oral history work. Okay, so I want to just define urban renewal a little bit. Probably most people in the room know what it is. It began with the Housing Act of 1949, in which the federal government said they would cover two-thirds of the cost of acquiring and clearing land for renewal. And the key thing was that you had to agree to tear down what was there. It was a slum clearance project. And there was an embrace of demolition itself as progress. It's something I talk about unsurprisingly in my book called Bulldozer. But you can see some of the delight and embrace of this, I think, just on the face of Robert Moses here as he sits, operating a bulldozer in New York City. That it was exciting to build new modern buildings. It was also exciting just to tear things down and create a deceptively blank slate for new development. You can see it here. You could also see it in more popular culture representations like this book, which is called The Affable, Amiable Bulldozer Man. I mean, look at the smile, right, on the face of the bulldozer operator there as he happily tears down a building from 1880. As a result of this policy and the federal funding and a variety of factors, demolition was rampant in the United States in this period. And in the 60s, 1960s, you really had this peak period of demolition. On average, in cities across the country, more than 1 out of every 20 dwelling units fell during that 1960s period. We still have demolition, right? But it wasn't as widespread in so many hundreds of cities and at this level as we saw during that period. But there are also many critiques of urban renewal. I think we know many of these well. Jane Jacobs, Herb Gans, Martin Anderson, and others who critiqued that actually the neighborhoods that were being labeled as slums weren't necessarily so blighted as people said, so irredeemable, that there were communities there that were worth saving. Others looking at the architecture and the built environments and seeing how those contributed to really organic and lively street life. And for other perspectives too that said that the cost of this was never going to be balanced out by the new taxes. Like it wasn't going to pay off economically too. So there were a lot of different criticisms of this policy. Another critique was about what happened to the people who were displaced. About 1 million families and over 100,000 businesses were displaced as a result of urban renewal. Nationally, as we know, these burdens were unevenly distributed. About 2/3 of the people who were displaced were non-white, earning the program the nickname, which was apt, of Negro removal. And here we see an image of one relocation agent assisting a family in Southwest Washington, D.C. Talk about where to relocate to. Southwest, 99% of the neighborhood was bulldozed. That's kind of classic clearance-based urban renewal that relates to that 1949 Housing Act. But with the Housing Act of 1954, the federal government was open to other modes of renewal. You didn't have to tear the buildings down. You could rehabilitate, you could preserve them, restore them. That also would be eligible for the funding. And so in places like New Haven, Connecticut, and in what was called the Washington Square East Project in Philadelphia, renamed Society Hill, those ideas were put into practice. And these were some images that were showed to Congress in the 60s when the Urban Renewal Administration was testifying about how this project worked. Rehabilitation also offered the prospect that not as many people would necessarily be displaced, right? If you weren't tearing down their home, they didn't necessarily have to go in the same way that a clearance-based project would operate. Here's a quote from William Slayton, the commissioner of the Urban Renewal Administration, who said in his testimony back then, Rehabilitation is to bring the area up, to improve the area for the residents who are there, so that there is not the exodus, the movement of people, the relocation of families. Rehabilitation makes it possible for people to stay in their neighborhood. Now, that's all well and good for a bureaucrat to report on that, but I wanted to look at what did historic preservation really mean in practice on the ground? And you could hardly think of a better place to explore that question than in Society Hill, where also these ideas about what preservation meant were also being figured out. And in order to do that, I looked at kind of the parcel by parcel experience of what happened there. Now, you may or may not know Philadelphia. Center City is kind of the original 2 square miles of the earliest version of the city, and Society Hill is on the eastern section of that. It's one of the earliest settled parts of the city. On the right, you see a picture of a man named Edmund Bacon, who was the planner of the city, who was really responsible for a lot of the thinking behind this project. Here he is talking about the relationship between their preservation-based approach to urban renewal and a clearance-based one. I hope the audio will be appropriate level. Let's see.
Clearance the absolute minimum. I would very carefully tailor the edges of it so that I didn't take anything away except that what was necessary to just restore strength and health.
All right. I think the other clips will be a little longer, louder. That's my own problem with the audio calibration. But he was just talking about how do you figure out which you were going to clear away, which you were going to keep. And it was really this kind of scalpel-like process that they proposed. Rather than the bulldozer kind of clearing everything away, they cut away what they felt needed to go. So let me give you a little bit of context about this area. As I said, Society Hill, one of the earliest settled parts of the city. And in this area, the Free Society of Traders, which was a business that settled in this part of the city, that name, that Free Society of Traders, was something that was brought back, as you know how real estate agents and the branding of neighborhoods go. Rather than call this Washington Square East, they called it Society Hill, drawing upon that earlier group that had settled in the area. And of course, when this was settled, it was a very mixed area. This is the walking city. You had mansions alongside the housing of lower income people, maybe who were working as servants and things like that. A very integrated neighborhood, even though we think about this name, Society Hill, as like a beacon hill, like something aspirational and upper class. It was actually a much more mixed area at the time. And it was this man, Charles Peterson, who was an architect and one of the founders of the Historic American Buildings Survey, if you're familiar with that, who lived in the neighborhood, came to live in Society Hill when he became architect at Independence National Historical Park, just to the north of the neighborhood. And he was the one who advocated for preserving as much as possible. He kind of butted heads with Bacon a lot of times about how much really should be preserved. And he was the one who christened the neighborhood as Society Hill. Okay, so a little bit more about the evolution. By the early 20th century, the neighborhood was largely inhabited by Eastern European immigrant population. A lot of the larger buildings had been broken up into multifamily apartments, rooming houses, things like that. You can see this is not a redlining map, but it's that type of an appraisal map. And so where you can see the pink was where African Americans were living. This is actually the edge of the 7th Ward. If you're familiar with W.E.B. Du Bois's famous survey, social survey, that's an African American area of the neighborhood. The blue, the Jewish Eastern European immigrants. And that was the makeup of the community. African Americans represented only about 20% of the residents. And I said, you know, the correlation between urban renewal and Negro removal. This wasn't a largely African American neighborhood, but in the same way, the Jewish population that was there was less powerful, less affluent, less able to stand up to the political forces that wanted to displace them. So in that way, very much in keeping with how sites were selected for urban renewal. All right, so now I want to segue into taking a look at some stills from my website, Preserving Society Hill, where I tried to piece together what exactly happened here. It was a project that used conservation, rehabilitation, preservation, but there was still a lot of demolition. And so if you go to the website, which don't do it now, do it afterwards, please spend some time on the website, You'll see this outline here are the bounds of the historic district. In 1971, it was designated nationally. In 1999, it was designated locally. And the urban renewal area was basically the rectangle right in the middle there. So they overlap pretty much exactly. And I've used the website's interactive map tool to show you all the parcels that were labeled for demolition. So a lot of demolition, even though this is a project that was preservation forward. Still, much less demolition than you typically saw. Remember I said Southwest Washington, D.C., 99% demolished. So this is a different take than that. In this section right up here, you may notice that basically the whole several block area is labeled for demolition. And that's because that was the site of a wholesale food market that was located there, that it made sense being close to there had been some rails along the river and shipping there. Made sense when it was established a long time ago. By the mid-20th century, the streets weren't well suited to the large tractor trailers that came through, the highways. There were a lot of people advocating, let's move this out. There were logistical reasons for that. It was also, I think, there are a lot of those same Eastern European residents who were the vendors there. We can certainly see connections between demographics of the population that made their livelihood there and displacement that would happen with housing, seeing that happen commercially too. So this all got relocated to what's closer to, if you know Philadelphia, the stadiums and the airport in the south of the city. And that's a story that happens with food markets in cities across the country. So that's a clearance project. And that's actually what got redeveloped first to kind of clear that away and make it more appealing for residential uses, appealing. So it's the Dock Street Market, and those are some of the buildings. You could see the crowded stalls there. Here's the clearance, and then the high-rise towers, Society Hill Towers, which are 31 stories tall, built by IMP, completed in 1963. So that's kind of a typical tower in the park urban renewal project, and it's how this one began, but it's not what was characteristic of the vast majority of the project. And I want to take a look at that other piece. This image here really shows the combination of preservation right next to new construction, and for which Philadelphia, was such a leader that Ed Bacon found himself on the cover of Time magazine for what he was doing. From architectural forum to Time magazine, the project was strongly discussed. Okay, so that was the demolition. There was also a lot of rehabilitation and just continued use of what had been there. So if you filter on that use, these parcels are the ones. And I want to take us through some of those and see what happened on those sites, as well as some of the demolition sites. And a lot of the areas that weren't demolished were more in the southern portion of the project area. Okay, so when you're on the website, if you click on one of those parcels, it'll pull up the information that I was able to gather with the help of research assistants on each of those sites. So this is one example site, not a random one, because I'm going to tell you more about this property, but its story is typical. So you'll go to the page and you'll get a description of what the building was like at the time of the historic district being founded. You'll get all the photographs that we've been able to gather that show how it's changed over time, and then some basic details about the property, what was planned to happen during urban renewal, what kind of use it had before, what was planned to happen afterwards. And just to aggregate this, it's about 1,500 parcels that made up Society Hill. And a digital website, a map, seemed the perfect way to organize this information, try to spatially connect what we knew about these sites to understand, well, what were some of the reasons maybe why certain buildings fell and certain ones didn't, and what happened. So I developed the website both to organize this information and do spatial analysis, and also as a tool of community engagement, because people learn about the project, they want to share their stories, so it works in two valences. I'm still spreading the word. Spreading the word about digital humanities projects is like a different step. You can publish a book. It's hard to get people to know about your book too, but at least it ends up in the card catalog, and digital humanities projects are a little bit different. So I'm glad to be able to tell you all about this today. Okay, photographs are a big part of the project, and they're a logical thing to include for this story because they were integral to the planning of the project. So this is a collection of images from the 1950s that I found in my research that planners hired a photographer to go and photograph parts of the neighborhood. There's one card for each block area within the neighborhood. And they didn't photograph every building, but they photographed all the areas that are marked in red there. And they were conducting a visual survey of what should stay and what should go. And if you look at these images, you find a preponderance of some of these types of scenes where you have fire escapes, awnings, garage doors, commercial signage, parked cars, right? Terrible stuff, right? The things that were the problems, the commercial uses, as they were trying to compete with the suburbs, getting rid of the mixed use nature of this neighborhood, which was industrial, commercial, and residential. How do you compete with a Levittown, which has a segregation of uses? Well, they were trying to bring that single use mindset and reality to Society Hill, and you can see that in the photographs. Noticeably absent from a lot of these photographs are people. They complicate the story because it wasn't just about buildings. It was about who lived where and who had the power and who could be displaced. But it becomes much more abstract, scientific, public health oriented, physical versus social, I think, when the people get removed, which is part of why I felt quite strongly about bringing people back in as much as possible with this oral history dimension of the project. And this is a screenshot of just a few of the people whose stories are available. And if you go to this section of the website, they're linked. If you go to an address for which there's an oral history, it'll tell you that there's one, or you can just go read the oral histories. I still struggle with the fact that no one really wants to read a really long oral history on a website, but we're excerpting some short audio clips to make it a little bit more interesting. We're integrating it into walking tours. We're making use of it, but it's there for those who want to access this information. And as I said, there's almost 100 oral history interviews on here. All right, now I want to take you on a little bit of a tour of primarily row houses, but not exclusively, to say what did urban renewal mean? What did preservation mean in this neighborhood? So we'll start with that building that I already showed you at the corner of Pine and South 4th Streets, 352 South 4th Street. And this is a picture of what the building looked like prior to urban renewal. It's part of a mixed-use neighborhood. You've got a Spanish language electronics shop on the ground floor. On the 2 floors above, you got 2 apartment units, one of which is occupied by the owner of the store. This was a working class neighborhood at the time where the median income was half the city average. More than 80% of the housing units were rented rather than owned, and fewer than 4% of adults had completed college. And just a year after this photo was taken, the urban renewal project officially was approved. Now, when a man named C.J. Moore purchased this property as part of urban renewal in 1966 for $10,500, he signed an agreement that said he had to complete certain physical changes to the building, acts of restoration that he had to do within 2 years in order to continue owning the property. And he recalled in his urban renewal and his oral history interview spending $130,000, a lot of money at that time to complete the work. Although this was his choice, he had the means, he hired an architect. Not everyone did it that way. Some people did it themselves, especially if they were young architects, just graduated from Penn. They could do it more cheaply. But this lists some of the things that he had to do. It's all part of the deed when he purchased the property. And in the end, the building ends up looking like this. And you can see, what it meant to restore this property, what preservation meant. I'm sure you can notice lots of changes here, but just to call out a few things, the modernist commercial windows, gone. The commercial use entirely gone. You can't see it so well in this photo, but when I bring students around on walking tours, it's very clear that those windows were removed. You can see in the brickwork that something's happened. The windows have been kind of put back in time, right? There are these 1/1 windows, and they're following what had been there historically with replacement windows. They added back in the shutters. Sometimes people found those in the attic or the basement, but more often they had to fabricate new ones, and the Historical Commission would tell them what would be historically appropriate. Other things, the height of the stoop changes too as it goes from commercial to residential use. So lots of different things, adding up to a pretty hefty bill for what restoration meant. The main thing, though, is that this is now a strictly residential building, no space for the commercial anymore. Okay, what happened on the inside, on the back? Those things, you could do whatever you wanted. So the Historical Commission's power was really only on the street-facing facades and what could be seen. So you see new modern windows going in the back. Those are not historically accurate, right? But that's okay. And the interior, you could do whatever you wanted to. And there is C.J. Moore, the owner, standing in the middle. The building is on the inside, completely going down to the studs and being reorganized entirely. So while the Historical Commission was approving of the restoration of interiors. They had no power over that, and Moore was not interested in that either. Here's an example of what one of the oral history pages looked like. This is C.J. Moore, and if this was a live page, we could scroll and read his full commentary. I just want to play a little clip about him talking about, why he chose to make the interior modern rather than historically accurate. Let's see how the volume that I said is.
I decided it was crazy to try to make the inside 18th century. I wasn't interested in it from that point of view, and it would have been all fake, so.
I apologize. I haven't done a great job on the audio, but he just said I decided it was crazy to make the inside 18th century. I wasn't interested in it from that point of view, and it would have been all fake, right? So he saw no reason to do that, and so there's this mixture of the modern interior with a kitchen that could be straight out of the suburbs. Here's some pictures of what that interior looked like because he had the inside photographed professionally. Here's the architect sitting on the wall-to-wall carpet in the living room. There's the new staircase. That's not historically accurate. And the kitchen, straight out of Levittown or something like that, right? So for renewers like C.J. Moore, preservation meant exterior restoration, where it was visible, but freedom for more modern aesthetics and lifestyle materials for everything that was removed from the sidewalk view. Just a couple of doors north of Moore's property, so this, let me see. This is where C.J. Moore lived, and just a couple doors down, another property owner, Rob Parsky, was an architect, and he combined two buildings together. And this is what the interior of his looked like when he sold it in 2019. So I had a chance to get a photograph that way, right? So that's one mode, restored exterior, modern interior. Let's move to the east in the neighborhood. Others were more interested in really being historically accurate. At this location, 217 Spruce Street, the owners were really invested in taking this accuracy to the extreme. Agnes and C. Jared Ingersoll were the owners. They were wealthy suburbanites attracted back into the city, so one of the target demographics, bringing people back into the city, the Holy Grail, one of the Holy Grails of urban renewal. And as Agnes Ingersoll told a reporter in 1961, quote, "We decided to put it back as nearly as possible to its 18th century condition, adding nothing but heat, electricity, and a minimum of plumbing as unobtrusively as possible. My husband even suggested restoring the privy instead of putting in bathrooms, but he looked relieved when I said no." And you had the freedom to do what you wanted. But stories like this, were published in newspapers. This is the Detroit Free Press. And there was a certain cachet, right, to being part of this historical revival. Again, though, in the modernizing city. So this interesting way where preservation is also modern and desirable and competes with the suburbs. All right, let's go to another property. So that's where we were with the Ingersolls. Now we'll go down here to two properties on Delancey Street. Not every row house rehabilitation was as extravagant. In particular, if you lived in the neighborhood, you had a chance to keep your property if you could afford to do the restoration work. And not surprisingly, owners of more modest means didn't go out and hire an architect for $100,000. They did kind of the minimum necessary, probably just a lot of exterior restoration work, or not, I shouldn't even say a lot, a minimum amount of exterior restoration work. And that was the case at this one property, 242 Delancey Street. In 1960, Anthony Gogolski signed an agreement with the Redevelopment Authority to rehabilitate his property. So he already owned it, but he had to sign this agreement to say that he would do this rehabilitation work. He had owned it since 1928, so he had been a long time resident. He only held on to it for 5 more years after signing that agreement, but as a result, he was able to benefit from the increased sale price of what happened there, right? So I don't know what motivated him to leave, but by participating in this upgrading of the property, he was able to experience some of the financial benefits of what was happening in the neighborhood. Another example, just a few doors down from there, 246 Delancey Street was the home of the Smith family, who moved there in 1948. In 1960, they signed their own agreement 1973, the male owner, Michael Smith, passed away, but the family continued to live there, passing it down generation to generation, and there's still a descendant living there. So they were not pushed out. And for them, preservation meant restoration, but in a much more modest way than people like C.J. Moore and Robert Parsky were doing. It certainly didn't extend to the interior, and as a result, they were able to stay in the neighborhood. And that's really one of the distinct differences, I think, of this rehabilitation-based approach. But of course, to just preview some at the end, there weren't that many people that were able to participate in that because of the cost that was likely involved. All right, let's keep moving. Another permutation, what could happen? We're now nearby our original site of 352 South 4th Street. At this property, 419 Pine Street, a man named Jay Pattison, who was an engineer, decided to build his own house on the property. So he built this one. It had been a leveled lot, and maybe at first glance, although I know I have a discerning audience here, maybe you're not fooled that this is not an old building. This is a neo-colonial design. It's quite playful. The glazed bricks are maroon. There's actually a two-car garage in the back. Okay, this is not a restored, colonial era home. But on the inside, Pattison decided that he was going to salvage materials from buildings that were demolished all around the neighborhood. So the pine floors, the ceiling joists, the doors, the marble fireplaces. He even insisted on hand plastering the walls. So these weird combinations of which buildings are actually the most historically accurate, right? Because he was so invested in this interior. I had to cringe because the current owners of the house recently moved out for about a year and had work done on the inside. So I don't know if any of this, that interior work remains, but it's a fascinating story of what it meant to move into this historic neighborhood, even though you were building a new home there. Okay, the modern examples of new construction are typically easier to spot than the one that I just showed you. So if we go, we're just moving back and forth. It's just a matter of blocks, right? This is all in a quite compact area. On the 200 block of Delancey Street, this double lot property was constructed by architect Romaldo Jurgala, who was a Philadelphia-based architect, constructed for Lynn and Franklin Roberts, a couple. And Franklin was worked in theaters, and so they incorporated these balconies and theatrical elements kind of into the interior of the building. Another modern building here, this had been a mixed-use commercial building with a tailor on the ground floor, and replaced it with this building here. And a couple who had been living in the suburbs decided to retire in the city, and they commissioned this one by architect Hans Egley. So the new construction, there were rules about what you could do. It had to fit in terms of materials, scale, massing, and these buildings did, but you weren't supposed to pretend to be old. It wasn't supposed to be Williamsburg. It wasn't supposed to be Disneyland. It was unabashedly modern, but fitting in. And so these are really classic examples of those kinds of guidelines that preservation could be consistent with new construction, and they weren't trying to fool anyone, generally speaking. But back to restoration. I want to take you back to 352 South 4th Street again, to talk a little bit about some of the debates that occurred. It wasn't always straightforward, like what really should be preserved and what would be allowed and how much history mattered. This is a drawing by architect Kip Stoll. He was the guy who was sitting on the wall-to-wall carpeting in that photograph. And this was his proposal for what would happen with this building. It actually looks a lot like the photograph that I showed you, the before and after. But here is an earlier photograph from 1860 of this same building. And the Historical Commission had uncovered this photograph. And when they found it, someone wrote on the back that this is a must for restoration, that we would base the restoration on visual evidence like this. And one thing that differed between this photograph and the proposal was the location of the doorway. Maybe you've noticed that, right? So there's the door as proposed is on what is Pine Street. And in this photograph here, 4th Street, completely different facade of the building. And so there's this debate. When Stoll submitted this, the commission said, no, you need to do the door as shown in the photograph. And here's what the Historical Commission wrote. Because the record is incontrovertible, the commission strongly recommends that the doorway as shown in the 1860 photograph be restored for the sake of historical accuracy, right? Photographs As I said before, were kind of the basis for what to do with planning, and now they're also going to be a basis for what will happen in terms of preservation. There was a back and forth. I know you can't read all the text on here, but I'm showing you. I found back and forth a correspondence where the owner said, I have photographs of my own that I took in the basement, and I'm going to show you that I think actually that doorway is an addition. And with those photographs, was able to reverse the plan. But the photographs were only useful, were only considered as evidence when it was useful. Because the photographs also showed a sign that said coal right next to that door, showing that there had been actually some commercial uses going on at this property 100 years prior. But that didn't instigate the Historical Commission to say, okay, we can continue to have commercial uses, right? So it's a selective reading of the historical record, maybe for more aesthetic reasons than for functional reasons, that photographs were selectively valued for their evidence in this story. Okay. The general eradication of commercial uses, I mean, it characterized the whole neighborhood. I'm just giving you a little snippet. So here you can see what this building here is 352, having its ground floor commercial stripped out. And this is all entirely residential right now. That's 352, and there's, yep. Okay, and then if you move further down the block, just another example, all commercial uses here and replaced by housing. Mixed use giving way to strictly residential use. So the project was as much, if not more, about this use, changes in use and controlling use as it was about the preservation of particular architectural styles and forms. Now, not all neighborhood businesses so easily agreed to be displaced. There were dozens and dozens of businesses in the neighborhood, and about 6 or 7 of them got together, developed a petition, and pleaded their case at a public meeting in front of the Historical Commission, asking to be made exceptions, to be allowed to stay. One of them was located at this corner here. It was at 340 Spruce Street, and it was the site of the Royal Hand Laundry. Now, it wasn't a place where laundry was cleaned. You just dropped off your dry cleaning there, and it would be sent out. So there wasn't, there was nothing chemically contentious going on there, right? In terms of you maybe don't want to live next to these chemicals. And the owner of the business, it had been in operation for over 25 years. In fact, it had been a commercial site for 100 years, and he lived above, right? So the typical story of the mixed-use property. Harry Altman was the owner, and here's a little video clip. I think the audio, I think I did make this one loud enough, talking about his experience as he was arguing to try to get to stay in the neighborhood.
First of all, I have my whole life invested in this neighborhood. The business was left to me when my dad died. I had to support my mother, sister, brother. In 1948, I finally was able to buy this building where I'm at, and I struggled very hard to pay the mortgage on it, and finally, in '58, I was through with the mortgage, and I felt a little more secure. I've been working all my life for that, to try to make my middle-aged years a little more secure than what I had it before.
I chose to live in Society Hill above any place in the world because of its great convenience, because of the wonderful neighborhood stores. And Harry Altman, I think, renders a great public service. He not only cleans my clothes beautifully, does all my laundry, washes sheets and underwear, everything, washes things beautifully. And he's just a pickup, you know, they go on to other places. But he cashes checks for me. If I say my heels are run down, where's the cobbler? He said, I'll take it to the cobbler's for you. Or I run out of bread and he loans me a loaf of bread. Or just anything. He's a magnificent neighbor, and I'm very proud to have him for a next-door neighbor.
All right. So Harry and these other business owners made their cases in front of the Historical Commission. He also offered to pay for some renovations to the exterior of the building such that it wouldn't look commercial anymore, such that it would fit in with the look. And presented the petition to the planners, and they said that any exception would endanger the validity and survival and success of the whole plan, and there was no room for exceptions. And even Charles Peterson, that preservationist I mentioned to you, he happened to live a few doors down. He had signed the petition. He saw no, in terms of preservation, no challenge of having this business right there. But it's more of this planning conflict, actually, that pushed out a lot of the businesses, and Harry Altman lost out. This is a depiction of what the building looked like shortly after, and this is what it looks like today. And these stories, again, if you look carefully at the bricks, you can see that something has happened, but a lot of this history, few people would believe that the neighborhood was as mixed use as it was, and what a vital part of the neighborhood it was to have those business owners there. All right, I want to talk a little bit not just about the housing, but about the other institutions. Why were there so many areas that were designated for demolition, as I showed you early on when we talked about the market? But there were other places that were marked for demolition, and it seems that the planners used demolition and clearance as a way to lure institutions in particular into staying as anchors in the revitalized neighborhood. So especially when it came to Pennsylvania Hospital, a lot of the churches and synagogues too, their footprints expanded such that they built playgrounds, convents, schools. They expanded their footprints, and that's why buildings were demolished, so that they would agree to stay and be kind of the foundations for the new neighborhood. So this map shows really a plethora of institutions in the neighborhood. And I'm going to take you through just a few of them. So just in this little snippet here, you can see different faiths represented, and the gray are properties, right, that are going to be demolished, and they're going to be demolished to give more space for the Presbyterian church that's here and the Episcopal church that's here, Catholic church also. They're all going to expand. So this is St. Peter's, and all those homes right there will be demolished to create a playground for the school. And I'll tell you the story here of what happens at Old Pine. So this is the before plan, and then the proposal illustrative site plan for what will happen. These were all mixed-use properties here along Lombard Street, which would be demolished. And right behind there were a swath of houses, working-class houses, that would also be demolished to create a parking lot. What was produced on this site were two new structures. One, a neo-colonial building that's a historical society for the Presbyterian Church nationally. The other, the Old Pine Community Center. And both of these are vital and in many ways beloved parts of the neighborhood today. The community center, it has a gym where there are recreational leagues, there's a daycare, there's a food pantry. It was a voting site until COVID moved some things, but these are important parts of the neighborhood. But the irony, of course, is that in order to create a community center, a community was displaced, right? The people who were living there. And in order to create this historical society, historic buildings, many of them had been designated individually, were knocked down, right? So there's these real tensions and ironies to the place of history versus the place of the modern revitalized neighborhood. Okay, beyond housing and institutions alone, I know landscape architecture is one of my sponsors here. I need to say something about something green, right? No, but this is a part of the neighborhood as well, this idea to establish greenways, because to the north of the neighborhood was Independence National Historical Park, where Liberty Bell and Independence Hall is located. And the idea was to knit together that area with the neighborhood by creating these pedestrian pathways. So not just catering the neighborhood to cars, creating a way for pedestrians to navigate their way through, but to do so required the demolition of buildings to create, oftentimes, to create these greenways. So here's Ed Bacon standing in Future Park, Three Bears Park, and this picture really forecasts what is to come. He wanted the greenways to connect to that spire of St. Peter's Church there. And indeed, if you look 1 year later after that photo, the buildings have been torn down to create a greenway. They knocked down about 5 houses that had been located there. And the greenways are a vital part of the neighborhood, part of the social life. They were designed by a landscape architect who taught at Temple for many years. So these two are important, I think, to the success of the area, but they came at a cost of people losing their homes. Here's a park that was built, kind of connected by all these greenways. These parks were important to the idea of attracting families in from the suburbs. This is one of the main goals of urban renewal, not just to reverse white flight and the loss of residents to suburban areas, but really to keep families too. And that was a hard thing to do. Many cities were building these high rises that weren't as appealing as a suburban house might be for a family. Society Hill did offer towers and row houses and parks and expanded schools, and did have some more success than most places in attracting families. I have a brief clip from a woman, Libby Brown, who moved into the neighborhood. She talks about the importance of places like this, building parks like Three Bears Park, and how it contributed to the development of community.
Delancey Park, or Three Bears Park, opened up around that time, so that was a great magnet for us all, and much of the social life was there, and of course we were all helped by the babysitting co-op, and I couldn't have managed without that. I think we all felt the same way, and so developing good relationships, friendships with the other mothers and the little kids, and watching them all grow up together was really wonderful.
So that's one perspective on the importance of these parks and greenways. But what about the perspective of those who had been living on sites that would be displaced for the creation of it? Here's some of the buildings that were located on the site where that greenway would connect to the spire of St. Peter's. These were working class homes, and there was a debate about where exactly the greenway would go. People didn't know. And this property here, 329 Pine Street, was the only property that went straight from Delancey to Pine Street. So it wasn't two properties, right? A single property. And so the family that lived there, the Abercoff family, thought that for sure they would be the site of the greenway. It'd be easier to acquire one property. And so they proactively moved out of fear that they were going to be displaced. They didn't wait for the redevelopment authority to knock on their door and tell them what was coming. They moved away in advance. And here's an interview with the daughter of that family, Carol Abercoff, talking about, the question was, did your mother want to move? And here's her answer.
No, she didn't want to move, but she was convinced that the redevelopment authority, which had broad powers at that time, would take our property because it was the only one that went all the way through to Delancey Street.
And they didn't take the property, right? But they still got displaced. And when the final accounting of who's displaced, they don't even count, actually. They don't get tabulated as someone who's relocated. So lots of things happen kind of outside the official processes, too. And it's hard to put a number on exactly the impact of displacement. But some residents did fight back. And I'll give one example of this. There was a low-income housing association, the Octavius Hill Association, which owned a stretch of row houses. This was in the more African-American section of the neighborhood, although it was mixed race. And they were told by the redevelopment authority they had to rehab their buildings, and they determined they couldn't continue to serve low-income residents if they had to pay for this rehabilitation. I'm sorry, I was pointing to the wrong thing. This is where the housing was located. And a group of residents, led in particular by these two women, Mabel Dotson and Dorothy Miller, put up a fight. And they wound up getting the help of community legal services. And the battle split the neighborhood over, should there be room for low-income housing in this neighborhood? Even if they couldn't stay in that housing, could there be new housing built for them? And you'll be unsurprised to hear that there were people on both sides of that issue. Ultimately, they did succeed. I'll get to that, but here's Dorothy Miller talking about how she felt about being told that she had to leave her home simply because they wanted to upgrade the property.
I said, but I tell you what I think's happening. I think they're trying to get us out of here. And they're not shoving me just any old place. This is all we know. We grew up here, and I'm not going just where they want me to go. That's out of the question.
And so what ultimately happened was Dorothy Miller was relocated temporarily to another neighborhood, and after about a 10-year battle, she was able to move back to the neighborhood. She had lived her whole life, basically, in the neighborhood. She was a crossing guard at the school. She was committed to staying there. And this is an image of the property. She lived in one of the buildings here. And here's an image of the 14 new row houses that were built for low-income housing in the neighborhood. 14 units. That's not a ton, right? Given the level of displacement. But it shows what is possible. If you walk by, I'm calling these out, they don't even jump out in the neighborhood, right? It's possible if we could build new upper income housing, we could build low income housing, And this was a hard battle, but the fight, and she moved into the unit, kind of proves that it doesn't necessarily mean that displacement has to happen, but there needs to be a will, right? And there needs to be a lot of creative legal work as well, and development work. Okay. Miller was a renter, but existing property owners typically, as I said, they had to, if they wanted to stay, they had to pay for the renovations.
I guess you know that the redevelopment authority went around to each.
Let me skip that. If they couldn't pay for the renovations, the city would put a sign like this one. The Old Philadelphia Development Corporation is putting the house for sale and look for new buyers who would come. And so that was the process, this kind of indirect economic displacement that happened in the neighborhood. All right, so what were the final tallies, just to wrap this up? Even when there was that opportunity to stay, many people just couldn't do that, right? And Bacon, and the quote that I just skipped over, just talks about how, you know, it was better than most projects, but yes, if you couldn't afford it, you couldn't stay. This is the total number of families displaced in Society Hill, 580, surely an undercount. They didn't count people who lived in the rooming houses, because they didn't count as proper households to even begin with. They didn't count people like the Abercrombs who moved on their own, but a lot of people were displaced. And many people self-relocated, and so it's very hard to even know where they went. Even when people did get relocated by the redevelopment authority, future sociological studies often showed how they were, even if they were in better housing, the community bonds that were broken, the psychosocial impacts were devastating. So even when things kind of worked as well as they could have, they weren't that great. And here's what the demographics of the neighborhood looked like after urban renewal, well after, you know, the project had come to a close. You see the total population went down because a lot of those multifamily housing had been converted to single family. The demographics of the neighborhood, it got even whiter. Income increased dramatically, the class character of the neighborhood. So obviously, I told you that some people did stay, and they did, but by and large, the demographics changed dramatically. And so in a lot of ways, preservation-based urban renewal ends up looking a lot like clearance-based urban renewal, especially if we're talking about the social dimensions of this. Preservation, of course, played a mixed role in the process, right? The material, social, and cultural meanings varied from property to property. What was preservation? What should be preserved? Who should be preserved? And I think things were worked out in the process. The Historical Commission in Philadelphia was one of the earliest municipal historical commissions, and they were figuring out what preservation meant through this project. So the legacy of it really continues to shape the city today. There are many more stories to tell than the ones that I have told you today, and welcome you to take a look at the website to hear more of those stories. And I welcome, of course, the people of Society Hill to tell me more of their stories too. So this is an ongoing effort, but I hope this was a chance just to see what one landmark project looked like and what preservation looked like, how it fit into housing and how it fit into modernization, even when that meant kind of going back in time a little bit in terms of what the buildings looked like. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer questions. Yeah, it was here. There it is. Okay.
Great, and if anyone wants to raise their hand, I can give you the microphone for questions.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Wendy. I made it. So my question is, Kate, in her first email, mentioned you did some community engaged mapping. I wonder whether you could talk a little bit more about that, or whether it's possible to talk a little bit more without any graphics or something.
Without any graphics.
Well, I assume you haven't prepared.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the community engaged piece of this was very much working with the women who developed these oral histories, and then continuing to conduct oral histories too. That was that, and also when you click on certain sites, people have given me their photographs and too. So if they're contributing to the creation of the website, that's the primary way.
So So they didn't really draw maps with you. They're just you contribute in the content of the map.
No. What I do a lot is I give probably 4 or 5 walking tours a year through the neighborhood. And I do it especially with young people. So I've partnered with some of the, there's 2 high schools that study urban history in 11th grade, and they come down and we talk about, some of the students live in the neighborhood, some don't. But it's just a way of kind of activating their understanding of urban and American history through the neighborhood. The website is a tool. There's an audio component there too. But the things that I know to tell them, I've learned through doing this project too. So it's very iterative, but it's an in-place kind of walking. It's not interestingly digital or in any way. It's very traditional. But this piece really contributes to what I know and also enables people to do some of this on their own too. So there's all those aspects. I think it's more educationally engaged, and a lot of the material has been traditional archives plus those oral histories. Yep.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. It was great. I'm really intrigued about the pushing out of commercial and trying to figure out, and hopefully you can give some insight. Was it a blanket hatred of business, or was it restoration of the original composition, which there was no business? Because I look at 352 4th Street and I see storefront windows, and when they're required to do restoration, all of a sudden it goes back to full residential. But was the original use mixed use, in which case it would not by definition be restoration. It would be changing the original use.
So some of the properties were mixed use from the outset, but 352 was not. It's a very limited, so when we think about preservation, choosing one moment in time and kind of freezing a place in one moment in time, I think that's the kind of approach that was taken to Independence National Historical Park too, where things were torn down, important skyscrapers and things that were noteworthy, but weren't from this period of interest, and that's the same thing that you have. What was it like during that period? So some of it is historical accuracy, but that was very self-serving for the goal of actually eradicating mixed use, because it was believed that that would be how you would lure people back in, by really kind of recreating the suburbs in certain ways and getting rid of the tangential uses. Now, there were little industrial, and those groups, I haven't found evidence of them trying to stay. I think they saw that was going to be an uphill battle. But as these, straddling the mom and pop commercial uses were the ones who thought that there should be a home for them. Now, there were 2 commercial nodes established in the new Society Hill. One, it did not compensate for the number of businesses that were displaced. So if I had to put a number on it, maybe it's like 8 to 10 businesses could stay. One was on 5th Street, so 1 block over, and it was an A&P at the time. It's now an Acme. It was a supermarket and some smaller stores right there. And then there was Head House Square, which had historically been a commercial area. It had a very historic market. And so that was historically staying commercial and had shopping and commercial around it. So on the one hand, it's historical accuracy in the place of Head House. On the other, it's actually keeping up with malls and things like that and trying to mimic that kind of a thing. So it's another case of kind of selective use of the historical justification combined with very then contemporary ideas about what mixtures of uses should or shouldn't be.
So did they identify a date range that they were shooting for? We're going to pick 1875 or the 1850s to have people restore back to?
Yeah, the cutoff was basically buildings 1840 and earlier. That was what they were trying to have the buildings look at. So they were really thinking about that era of time. Yeah. But there are interesting exceptions, and those always catch my eye. There's a whole stretch of buildings that were built, neo-colonial buildings that were built, not what they wanted to do. And to my mind, if I look at the dates on those, it was getting late. It's into the 70s. These lots aren't developed, and then you don't follow the rules as much, and you try to get some tax-producing properties built. So there are plenty of exceptions, but those exceptions kind of demonstrate even more what some of the thinking was. Yeah.
Thanks so much for your talk. I so enjoyed it. And I should admit that I'm a Philadelphian, and I grew up partially 3 blocks from where you're talking about.
All right, I saw you shaking your head about the Acme. So.
Yeah, I've been to that Acme so many times. So I have 2 different questions. One is about the digital humanities side of things, and I'm wondering what the underlying structure is, if you used Omeka or something like that to put the website together. And the second question is more about the Head House Square, because of course that development has sort of fallen into disuse. And I'm sort of wondering, thinking through that part of the city, what kinds of trends you see happening in terms of historic preservation / reintroducing mixed use, because that was a project that combined some mixed use as well as the sort of commercial stuff. And the apartment complex just across is also one that had mixed use as a reintroduction in the 80s, I guess, and has also sort of fallen into sort of lack of occupancy and things like that.
Yeah, the New Market Square, I think it's called, yeah. So on the second question, I've looked at, I showed Southwest Washington, D.C. in part because that's another project I've studied closely, and the residential buildings that were built there were proved popular and have remained highly occupied, and that's true in Society Hill as well, whereas the commercial buildings, inconsistent. Some have been demolished, and to some degree that's true in Society Hill as well. So I think part of it is commercial versus residential. There was a need for housing that was, modern standards, and the commercial pieces, the preferences change too, and that's, I think, the kind of cycles that we see. And Head House has been an up and down story. Right now there was a Wawa there, and it recently closed. It's empty, exactly. It's interesting. There's a movement for a neighborhood watch that's getting. It's basically one man, but that is very active, and he played a big role in trying to get rid of that Wawa because there were some unhoused populations who hung out outside of it. And it actually gives me good insight into some of the battles in the Civic Association and the neighbors too, and the language that's being deployed about defending our historic spaces and things, and the way in which preservation gets appropriated and historical associations get appropriated for self-serving means too. So I think there's organic processes, and there's also some other things going on. The first question. Yeah, so to get into the nitty-gritty, so this is version 2 of the website. The first version I developed with our Price Lab for Digital Humanities at Penn, and it was all about Omeka. The oral histories are still Omeka, which is an open source kind of digital cataloging system. When I wanted to get beyond what I could do, kind of do it yourself, I got a grant and hired an outside developer. It's all open source, everything. But it's no longer Omeka, and so it's not Esri, it's open source GIS. So the idea is to use those kinds of tools, but Omeka is only for the oral histories at this point. I felt like I hit a wall what I could do on my own and with just RA expertise, and needed. And that's a challenge of the digital humanities. My own technical skills are actually pretty limited. I know what I want, and I increasingly know how to do it, but I didn't make this. I kind of managed the process. And then there's the question, which I grapple with all the time. These things cost so much money, and they have a limited lifespan too. But it was a learning opportunity for the students that I worked with too. So there's lots of things going on here. And as I said, this will feed into the book, which is a more traditional thing. But this won't last forever, even though I tried to choose things that were less reliant on proprietary software.
Thank you so much. You mentioned New Haven, and you mentioned Colonial Williamsburg, and just thinking about the content of your talk in relation to those has got me really thinking and wondering about the interplay between historic preservation on one hand and fantasies about both neighborliness and transportation, because like Vince Scully, before he cared about historic architecture, he was advocating for demolition in New Haven, and when I asked him, how could you have thought that way? And he said, we truly believed that even 95 coming through was a temporary gesture, because by 1970, most people arriving in New Haven for work would be coming by personal helicopters. He said, we really believed that. And Colonial Williamsburg is really just kind of saturated with fantasies about older forms of transportation like Disney, but also with a constructed sense of neighborliness. Like there's a lot of uniformity, but people are performing a certain way of neighborliness. So in some of the interviews that we, got a little glimpse of, or like the woman defending the business owner, she's saying, he gives me an extra loaf of bread. And I'm just wondering, as you're looking through all this material about like those themes of neighborliness, but also transportation, they would not have made these decisions. They didn't make decisions like this in New Haven before Worcester Square. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that based on what you've seen.
I've done a lot of research in New Haven, and the first big project there was the Oak Street project, which was a big clearance and connected with a highway that was never finished, actually, that was coming through. And Dick Lee was the mayor there, and he was such an advocate of clearance that he had Life magazine came and did a photo shoot, and the title of the article that resulted was City Cleanup Champion, and there's a picture of him operating the wrecking ball. So the equivalent of what I showed you of Robert Moses, and he's smiling, swinging a wrecking ball. He supposedly kept some buildings standing, so whenever people came to town, he could demolish a building. He just loved clearance. Okay, then a few years later, he's testifying in front of Congress saying how much he loves historic preservation, right? It's turned so quickly. How does that happen? A few things. It takes a long time, actually, to go from the cleared landscape to getting a big developer to come in. Like going with the smaller scale with multiple individual developers is a faster way to get things done, to get things back on the tax rolls. You don't have these terrible visuals of the empty lots that are just parking lots for way too long. So he goes from big clearance advocate to big preservation advocate, not because of some architectural epiphany, but for really practical reasons, right? And he loved his highways coming through too, because that displaced populations and helped to do the social engineering. So there's a lot. It all makes sense if you're just thinking about from a very self-serving way, what's going to be politically useful and what's going to yield the quicker results, right? And even in Philadelphia, Stephanie Ryberg-Webster wrote an article some years ago about why planners were actually the biggest advocates of preservation in Philadelphia in some of these projects versus the preservation, and why they were so excited, because it was cheaper, quicker. It wasn't that they were really interested in history. They saw it as a means to an end, and they saw that this clearance approach was actually not going to be as quick and easy and wonderful as everyone had said. And that's why I think you have that Housing Act that changes. 5 years later, suddenly you're welcoming rehabilitation. And there's lots of reasons for that, but it's a very practical answer too. Your second question about the neighborliness, yeah, that's an interesting question. The curation of that. In a place like Society Hill, you had competing groups of neighbors, and you had, in fact, competing neighborhood groups, the people who had lived there before, the people who were new, and so, yeah, who was neighbor, like who even got to count as a neighbor? This was up for grabs too. And so I haven't thought about it along that dimension as much, but it's a good question about this. In the oral histories, people do talk about it. The woman who talked about, Libby Brown, who talked about Three Bears Park, she talks about a man who used to sit on the stoop and smoke a pipe, and he was kind of the watchman of the neighborhood, and how quaint that was. But in fact, there was really a tension between some of the old timers who were there and the new people and the kids who were moving in too. So I think there's the drawings and the photos and these house tours that happened every year and still happen to create connections among people, but they only included like the new, the new restorations, the new arrivals, not the older people. So I think there were some really big divides, even though you had the two groups side by side.
Do we have one more question? Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Great, thanks
Francesca.
everybody.
Amazing talk.